Now presented for your consideration, a clip from AI, The Summoning Files, NirvanA Initiative, without any further context. I have history with Uchikoshi, the writer of AI, The Summoning Files, NirvanA Initiative, and boy, what a way to start a review. But given my propensity for dumping what I think about whole prequels in the video for their sequels, it is only fair that I show off my credentials of sitting on my ass all day reading visual novels by talking about my previous experience with Uchikoshi games. But for those who don't care, timestamps will be provided for you to skip to the main review, okay? Alright. But for those of you who do care, my history with games written by Kotaro Uchikoshi goes way back. Back to before I even knew he existed when I played Ever 17. Yes, that's right, Ever 17. I bet you expected me to say 999, but oh, I pulled a fast one on ya. I bet you never even heard of this visual novel before. Now, don't lie to me or yourself. Maybe you did, but that's unlikely because only like a dozen people know it exists, and I sure do because it was the second visual novel I ever played/read, and boy, what a doozy it was. It was filled with plot twists and tense tear-jerking moments. It was a beautiful novel, at least when it wasn't filled with boring filler and talking about cubes. What I'm trying to say is, it was good, but there was a certain level of roughness to it. It needed a little bit of polish. Not that visual novels don't constantly fall into the pitfalls of having half of it be slice of life situations. Like seriously, it's really cool when you show the characters interacting with each other and give us a sense of normalcy, but come on, stop having 30 chapters of cooking. Seriously, why do so many visual novels talk so much about cooking? But I digress. It was a really good game, but at that time I didn't even think about game critiquing. I was just a person enjoying the ride, and it was a very fun ride, I have to say. Now, fast forward to 999, because I never played Remember 11 or Never 7, and I still didn't know who he was, but damn, he wrote a very fine, very gruesome mystery game. One of the very first descriptions of the game is of an exploded man's exposed ribcage, reminding the protagonist of crab legs in a macabre way. Yeah, it was that kind of game. And it was, not gonna lie, pretty damn amazing. It also had a lot of gameplay. Unlike his previous outings, the game wasn't just reading and choices, but actually a series of escape rooms broken apart by visual novel segments, with, of course, mind-blowing plot twists once again being some of the most memorable parts of the game. It was followed by Virtue's Last Reward, a game with even more mind-blowing twists, with an even better plot, and it was just great. I can't find the right words to convey how great it was in a short sentence, so just take my lack of words for it. There's just one problem with the game. The plot ended on a cliffhanger, meaning the game's story was essentially incomplete. And after that, silence. Nobody knew if a sequel to finish the plot would ever come out. Who knows what was happening inside developer Spike Chunsoft, since they managed to make a much bigger hit in the form of the psychotically colorful Danganronpa series. Oops, here's a quick correction from editing me. Turns out that Spike Chunsoft did not make Danganronpa. Spike made Danganronpa. And Chunsoft made Virtue's Last Reward, but then they merged. I think my point still stands, that after they merged, they still didn't know if they should continue with Uchikoshi's Zero Escape series. I think that point still stands. But it's still kind of notable how I didn't even notice that they were two separate entities before Danganronpa 2. That must have been the world's least notable merger in the history of gaming. Like, holy shit, I always just thought of them as Spike Chunsoft. Sorry for that. Anyway, let's keep going on. They probably weren't sure on how to fit Uchikoshi's much more serious and dark tone into all of this. Those were depressing, dark times of uncertainty. But then, after a lot of fan demand, a sequel was finally announced, Zero Time Dilemma, and there was much rejoicing until it came out and it was shit. I honestly don't want to talk about it. It could probably be the material of an entire video, and maybe somebody already did a video on it much better than I could ever hope for. So just take my word for it, it wasn't very good. And it honestly became sort of a cautionary tale about not promising too much in a game if you don't know you can deliver. I mean, even if you're confident you can deliver, just take a step back and chill a little bit. Because I can't think of a worse thing to get in your hands as a narrative designer is a zero-time dilemma. You definitely do not want to release a zero-time dilemma. And after that there was Punchline, a much more fun and lighthearted story that's still filled with plot twists because of course it is. They even had an anime that came out before the game and it was fine. It was good. Honestly, I don't know how to feel about it, less because of the content, because I actually enjoyed the content, and more because the anime ended on a somewhat bittersweet note with a message, I don't remember exactly how it happened, but a message or an advertisement that it would be different in the game, which gave the impression that the game would have different routes and different endings that were not part of the anime, but actually no, it's still just an extremely linear story, only the game's ending is happier than the anime's ending. And honestly, what the fuck is even going on with this withhold the happy ending in the game to make people who watch the anime double dip into another medium bullshit? Like, what was the plan here? 90% of the story is still the same. Did they really just make people double dip for a happier ending? Because if that was the plan, that is honestly kind of scummy. But I digress, because finally, after all that time and twists and turns, a new mystery game was announced that was going to be written by Uchikoshi. And that was AI The Somnium Files. It got announced, and honestly I was just not really feeling it. The idea of diving into dreams as a source of mystery just didn't appeal to me, because dreams are very abstract and fluid, and I think of mysteries as a more concrete type of genre, so finding evidence in dreams that could be used to, say, sloppily patch some plot holes by saying that it was only a dream, bro, and leaving things at that and that sort of thing, I don't like that. However, my opinion changed when I saw the pre-released ARG that they came up with to hype the game. Basically, one of the characters in the game is an internet streamer, and they made up a YouTube channel filled with videos of her that slowly got darker and creepier as they foreshadowed plot elements that would supposedly be relevant in the game itself. It was overall very neat, and the way the ideas from the videos were presented reminded me of previous Uchikoshi written games that I enjoyed, so against my better judgment, I decided to buy the game. Now, it should have been a simple affair to get a brand new game that I bought on Steam to run on my PC, except that I didn't have Windows 10 at the time of release, and the game was simply unplayable on Windows 7 until the developers released a beta branch on Steam that supposedly, when downloaded, would make the game more stable. It did, but only in the sense that instead of unplayable, it only crashed about every half hour or so. I'm not gonna lie, it was absolutely miserable, and documenting this historical event is part of the reason I decided to do this entire segment in the first place, but I decided to soldier on anyway. And I'm glad I did, because while the release was a complete shit show, the game's plot was actually very, very good. It wasn't a perfect game by any means, there's definitely some glaring moments that I didn't like at all, but overall, The plot had both emotional beats and gruesome plot twists that really resonated with me, and that's more than what I had gotten from Uchikoshi or a lot of other visual novels in years, and in many ways, I kind of consider it almost a sort of a return to greatness, a sort of redemption arc for Uchikoshi. Not that he really had to redeem himself or anything, he just wrote a bad game after all, but hey, it was great. And even if it didn't reach the same heights as 999 or Virtue's Last Reward, it was still a deeply enjoyable experience. So, naturally, I got excited for his return once more for the Summoning Files sequel, NirvanA Initiative. So, does the sequel measure up to the original? Let's find out. Okay, I can't do this. I tried to segue into it naturally, but that just sounds too stiff and corporate. And you know what? I think I know of a more natural way to segue into the review, and it goes like... AI, the Summoning Files, NirvanA Initiative, and you know what, I'm just gonna call it AI too because that's a mouthful. Well, it is the sequel to the first AI, the Summoning Files game. Both are mystery games centered around a very interesting main concept / gimmick. All characters have a dream world inside of them called Somnium, and the main characters are called Sinkers, special investigators that can dive into these dream worlds to extract information from suspects and persons of interest. The main point of divergence between games is that while in the first game you play as a single character, Detective Kanamedate, with the help of his eyeball AI partner Aiba, and yes, every protagonist in this series has an eyeball that is electronic and has an AI inside of it, just roll with it please. But in AI 2, you get to split your playtime between two characters, Kuroto Ryuki, a rookie at Abyss, and Mizuki Date, a returning character from the previous game, who has grown to also become an investigator at Abyss. Both of them are separated by time, as Ryuki's segments take place 6 full years before Mizuki's segments, even though they are both investigating the same case. The half-body serial killings, a series of murders where the culprit separated the bodies of the victims in halves, with each half showing up 6 years after the first ones were discovered. If that sounds confusing, don't worry about it. Let's first talk about the gameplay before we delve into the main plot. And at first glance, the gameplay here is nothing too innovative. You play as a detective in first person with a cursor that you can use to examine things and talk to people, and you go from place to place, talking and examining until you've managed to push the plot forward. Both main characters do have the eyeball companion that I mentioned before that allows them to use different types of vision like X-ray vision and night vision in order to find clues, but those are all contextual. They only appear when you need to use them, so they feel less like tools in your toolbox and more like plot devices to make things happen when they need to. Same with Wink Sync, an ability that allows you to essentially read the minds of other characters should you need to, except you don't really do anything gameplay-like during a wink sync, so they just end up playing as little skits that may or may not be relevant to the plot depending on the moment. The summons, however, are where the fun really starts. Each summon plays out like a hyper-crazy version of an escape room game. Each summon has a series of mental locks that essentially act as checkpoints. As for why you would need checkpoints, it's because unlike classic point-and-click adventure games, where you can just try to combine everything with everything else until it works, in AI you can only stay in a summon for 6 minutes, with time slowing down to a crawl so long as you're standing still to give you some help. However, interacting with anything at all comes at a time cost as well, so you can't just try everything even if you remain still close to an object. No matter what you do, you must be careful with how you spend your time. Complicating things even further are timies, collectible items that allow you to affect time when you interact with an object, so you can, for example, shorten the time necessary to interact with an object by 30 seconds. But there are also negative timies that force your next interaction to also, for example, take twice as long. Because the way you get timies is by interacting with the objects in the first place, the straightforward path isn't necessarily the best. Some otherwise useless interactions might have good timies attached that you can use to do things even faster, and spending a negative timie on a short interaction is a good strategy even if the interaction is useless. All of which serve to add a new layer of depth to the puzzle solving. Now, that was already present in the first game, but this sequel adds even more new twists to the formula, because on top of timies, now you also have a shit ton of gimmicks that may or may not show up depending on the summoning you're in. You now have choices that you must make under pressure in a short amount of time, for example. And you also have to avoid conscious antibodies, which are essentially enemies that may or may not chase you around and which can quickly drain you of all your time when they get near you. There are plenty of interesting changes of pace all around, and I don't want to spoil them since they can get pretty wild. One point of comparison that I really do want to make with the first game is that this time around the nature of the puzzles are pretty different. In the first game, most of them operated on dream logic, like, well, you would expect from dream worlds, but this time around most of them operate on adventure game logic instead. A lot of them don't feel as dreamy as they did in the first game because they feel like basic logic puzzles dropped inside of a dream context. And you even get keywords that unlock as hints as you interact with the dream to help you find your way around. I feel like this is in response to players' frustrations with the first game's more dreamlike logic, but in the end this actually made the game a lot harder. While in the first game you could trial and error your way around, AI2 has plenty of puzzles with hard answers that you must input using a digital keyboard, some that won't even offer you a hint. I ended up getting stuck quite often. And special shout out to the team for bringing back the absolutely fucking worst puzzle of the first Dino Crisis, but managing to make it actually palatable this time. Gold star for you. Enough about that though, because beyond the Somnium, we must also talk about the brand new investigation mode added to this game, Virtual Reality. Virtual reality essentially allows you to walk around a full 3D crime scene using one of the protagonists to properly investigate what happened. Even though this is just a more elaborate version of normal investigation with you poking around everywhere, you actually get to choose when to use the different vision modes as part of your arsenal, and at the end of everything you have to select the correct choices to reenact what happened, sometimes solving some pretty tough puzzles along the way, with a little reward if you manage to complete everything without missing a single answer. So they ended up being the highlight of the new features for me. There are also QTE action sequences. Overall they're pretty simple, but I do think they are improved from the first game, from a story perspective at least, and also they do a cool thing when you do a series of QTEs, which I really like, because as we all know, everything is forgiven if it looks cool. Well, technically it's not, but let's just say it is for this one case. Regardless, they are once again here mostly just to push the plot forward, which, by the way, it's probably about the time we start talking about the plot, since the main thing you'll be doing in this game is not investigating crimes or fighting bad guys. Oh no, it is reading. And you will do a lot of reading. Which is why it is so important that the characters we follow are interesting, and that's a nail that AI2 hits right in the head. Not all of them are immediately interesting, since we do get a few wild, crazy designs and more suspicious personalities alongside a more bland looking part of the cast, but make no mistake, everyone has an important part to play in the plot, and more importantly, they are characters that you actually want to follow. There are villains that you want to see fail and allies that you want to see succeed, and all of that leads into a series of surprisingly well-crafted emotional moments, which was also a strength from the first game that I'm glad returns in this one. The first protagonist detective couple that you get to follow are Ryuki and Tama, a rookie agent and his dummy mommy AI eyeball, and they have absolutely great chemistry, working essentially the opposite way Date and Aiba worked in the first game, with Ryuki being a calm, dedicated officer and Tama bringing in the horny jokes to balance out his seriousness and earnestness, with an added twist of both of them having a few of their traits switched during the summoning segments, with Ryuki asking Tama to do some crazy entrances that Aiba would normally have done in the first game. They are, for all intents and purposes, a reversal of the first game's protagonists in the best way possible. The more odd couple here in terms of chemistry then are Mizuki and Aiba, another rookie agent with a penchant for snarky violence and her more wacky yet still somewhat subdued AI eyeball. Since both have a higher capacity for taking things seriously than any other protagonist so far, and with Mizuki being an absolute powerhouse of strength nobody can really intimidate, they work more like a pair of efficient, like-minded partners working together on the same case than falling in the usual tropes of trying to mix up characters of opposite personalities, though they are still held back by Mizuki's lack of experience and no hesitation in bringing out her violent gremlin tendencies whenever possible, which Aiba then needs to rein in, but hey, fine by me, I'm all for that chaotic gremlin energy. And of course, this strongly characterized main cast also has a lot of side characters to interact with, a lot of interesting cool side characters. You get Minecraft Steve, but he's a failed comedian, you get giant masked chef guy, and also a lot of other interesting people that I don't want to spoil. But if there is a weak link in the chain of characters, however, it is definitely and most unfortunately the returning characters. Not all of them, but a lot of them are here mostly just as glorified cameos that don't really do anything and only exist because, logically, a game starting a few months after the previous one and ending 6 years later would mean that these characters are still there, doing their thing, even if they aren't doing much of anything. And like I mentioned, there are exceptions, of course. There is the returning mermaid, who is wonderful, but honestly was barely a character in the first game. But for the most part, they're just there because. I have to give, though, a special shout out to my girl Iris for existing in this game solely to bring the absolute dumbfuck levels through the roof. But in terms of the actual main mystery that you're trying to solve, well, it is a lot harder to talk about it without spoiling anything, but I'll try my best. As I said in the beginning of the video, the plot follows two different characters, one 6 years in the past and one that is technically in the present, as they hunt down a serial killer. The problem being that this particular serial killer splits the bodies of his victims in half, with half of them showing up 6 years ago and the other halves showing up now. The same halves, by the way, of the same victims, in case that wasn't clear. And in both cases, when the corpses appear, the estimated time of death tends to be, well, about a few hours ago. So, as you might guess, our investigators are in quite the pickle trying to figure out the mystery of the time-traveling corpses. The actual investigating that you do, though, is pretty straightforward. You go to places, you talk to people, and you find some clues. The weirder sequences being when you dive into people's dreams for a trip into the symbolism realm, but even outside of that, the game delivers by getting you to engage not only with the interesting characters that I already mentioned, but also basically every single conspiracy theory that the writers found on Wikipedia. And I mean that 100%, no irony. One of the more important plot points, for example, are weird vaporwave style videos containing subliminal and or encrypted messages, which apparently make people disappear when solved, though most characters just believe it to be part of an ARG and they actually discuss out loud what an ARG is and how it might be being used for nefarious purposes, which, considering this game also had an ARG running using the same in-game creepy videos, mean we are approximately 9 layers deep into batshit crazy territory. And all of that's not even mentioning how not long after that conversation, we meet characters who love discussing philosophy by using GTA and Mario games as examples. And the list of craziness just keeps going on, but once again, I don't want to spoil anything. I just want to entice you to see firsthand just how nuts things can get. All of this, of course, serves to both foreshadow and obfuscate the trademark Uchikoshi plot twists that hide deep within this game, and once again, I will say nothing except for the fact that these are some crazy twists, the likes of which I personally have never seen before in a game. Even if I did see something similar before, I can't say I ever saw it executed with this sheer level of fuckery before. In most mystery games, when a plot twist happens, sometimes you kind of want to replay the game as soon as you finish, just so you can see all of the foreshadowing that was put in. But this time the twists are so wild that I felt like I had to replay the game immediately after finishing it just to understand what actually happened. I don't want to oversell it because maybe it's going to disappoint you. Just keep in mind that when I said I wanted to entice you to see firsthand just how nuts things can get, I wasn't kidding. Things can get pretty nuts. But I do want to talk about what happens around it. And if that sounds like it's too much for you, I'm not going to spoil anything, but if that sounds like it's too much for you and you already know if you want to buy this game or not, then you can tap out right here. But I really do want to talk about what happens around the plot twists. And to talk about this, I want to go back to a statement I said before about the excess of characters that have nothing to do with, that came from before, because it is not only the characters, but also the lore of the game that also suffers from not getting everything tied up in a bow, because the fact is, the first game did a great job of tying everything together in the end, not only every character, but every fact and even the lore of the setting. All of that got tied up together in the end perfectly. And that just doesn't happen here. Partly because, well, a second game has to follow the lore of the first game, so they couldn't hide new twists in there. But also because they end up just mentioning facts that end up not being relevant at all. You can bet that, and this is just a fake example, do not freak out, but you can bet that if a dog showed up in chapter 1 of the first game, it would definitely be relevant 20 hours later, even if it did not seem relevant at first. But not here. Here, facts and backstories can just be mentioned, and that's the end of that. And that's not necessarily bad, as it does provide a lot of red herrings for the main mystery, but it is a different type of writing nonetheless, one that I'm less fond of than the one of the first game. What I do think ended up being a straight up negative, however, is the sheer amount of plot conveniences that exist this time around to make the story work. You probably have to use both hands to count the amount of times characters just can't upload their findings to the cloud, or mysteriously vanish, or get amnesia, or go insane, or just refuse to share information that they don't need to withhold at all for the sake of getting the plot to work. Sure, that happened in the first game as well, but it was used very sparingly, with characters having proper motives to withhold information, and the few times your technology failed being used for dramatic irony. Here though, you can just feel the magician behind the curtains working as hard as he can to get the plot from imploding. When one of the first things you hear when you start the past segment is that the super ultra magic cloud is out so you can't upload evidence to it, that's already a pretty bad sign of plot convenience right out of the gate. But that still does not compare to when the game separates characters from long periods of time, or just straight up make up backstories or facts about them just in order for the plot to work, because it feels like the game is robbing us of one of its biggest strengths: the character interactions and their motivations. All of this though feels kind of inevitable. I think this is partly because AI2 is simply a more ambitious game. While it does build from a previously tested foundation on a gameplay level, on a story level it is trying to juggle two protagonists across different times as they investigate the same convoluted as hell murder case. And that is an incredibly ambitious premise to set up and follow through successfully. And make no mistake, the game does follow through on it, but it simply doesn't manage to do so in a natural way, which is why I personally like the story of the first game more than the story of this one. Ultimately though, it will all fall down to preference. AI2 isn't a worse game than the first AI, it's just a different one. While the first game was more restrained and self-contained, the second one plays it a lot faster and looser in service of a more ambitious open plot, and which one you like the most will depend on what kind of mystery you like to solve. In the end, I can say two things for sure. The first is that this game is completely self-contained. It does not end with a cliffhanger, but rather it concludes gracefully, so thankfully we are spared of a possible zero-time dilemma situation should we ever get an AI3. And the second thing is that, in spite of the bumpy road to get there, I greatly enjoyed the ending. Just stick around even if you think you know how things will pan out until the very end, because if there's anything we can say for certain about Uchikoshi, is that you can never really know how things will really pan out in the end. Overall, this is it for NirvanA Initiative. It doesn't reach new heights, but it does manage to stand on its own on the same level of its predecessor, which honestly is more than I expected. Sequels do tend to not feel as special as the first time around, when you had no idea what to expect after all. But in the case of AI, I think what we got here is something that is just so rare that whenever it shows up, it just feels special. And the page-turner nature of the mystery meant that I just couldn't stop playing once I started, which is why it took only 1 weekend to finish. And even after all that time, as I'm writing this script, and as I'm reading this script, and possibly as I am editing this video as well, it still stuck with me, and I really wanted to get out my opinions on it. It is the kind of game that you don't see every day, but I'm still glad that I get to see it every once in a while. And I do believe fans will be satisfied with it, and newcomers, surprisingly enough, can also jump right in with no issues and no spoilers for the first game. So to anyone who can handle some anime on their bloodstream, I highly recommend AI The Summoning Files, NirvanA Initiative, as one hell of a mystery game. Thanks for watching.